No, perfect. Can you talk briefly about self-healing? I understand that was an experience you had at Bell with Jim's product.
Yes. hmm so self-healing. So a lot of times, communication in large organizations, even smaller organizations, don't happen seamlessly, right? So there could be a table structure change on the source that is not communicated to the data warehouse team. And Jim's product actually has a process where in every other product, it will fail. If you even just rename, if you take one letter out of a field name, most ETL products or ELT products will fail because that's not what they're expecting. Jim's product will actually incorporate that, isolate that, and make you aware that something has changed in the source without failing the job and still getting the data, because the data over when applicable. So if there's an additional column that's added to a table, everything else has stayed the same. It will bring in that additional column and isolate it, but move the data into the data warehouse as well, which is a really, really good tool, because what will happen is when you have transactional systems, if you start failing jobs, you now are losing data because those transactional systems are changing over time. And by the time you figure out what has actually changed, you could have lost 2 or 3 days worth of data changes, which sometimes is extremely critical.
Yeah, no kidding. I want to go back. I want to go back to the conversation on ETL versus ELT. And can you talk to that for a second for the audience who may not be as familiar? I'm sure that everyone's familiar with it, but why is it so important, that shift of 3 letters?
So that shift is extremely important because it's for validation, data quality, and a lot of other just data issues. So extract, transform, and load means that you're pulling data from the source. Before it gets landed, you're actually changing the data. And by the time you land it, the data that's landed is not the same as in the source. So going back and trying to figure out what changed, or that backward lineage, you have to go through the code to figure out, okay, what transformations happened. When you extract, load, and transform, you're actually pulling the data as is from the source into the staging area, whatever you're landing it to. And so that way, you can compare source to landing and say they're exactly the same. And then any transformations that happen as you're loading it into the data warehouse tables, it's all controlled. So when you're doing troubleshooting, it's a lot more difficult to compare something that's already been transformed to the source than to compare the landed data to the source data when it's exactly the same. You can see where that issue is happening. So you can really rule out that it happened during the extract process and the load process. Second thing is that just depending on your resources, a lot of transaction systems, if you're doing it, some organizations actually create resource contention on their transaction systems. So they're using the same resources and memory and things like that. Now it's being done on this other server. So your transaction systems are not being slowed down. They are as is, untouched. We're just pulling data out of there. And there's not a lot of heaviness. It's not resource intensive on the transaction systems. So that means that your daily processes and your business processes and your sales can continue happening without any interruption.